Good morning, everyone, or, well, depending on where you are, good afternoon, good evening. Thank you for joining us today on our webinar on how to rock the MBA interview. Hopefully you're attending this because you got great news and you were invited to interview somewhere. We'd love for that to be the case, in which case you're looking to get ready and you're looking to prepare. For some of you, however, that news hasn't come yet. I know the next couple of weeks are going to be pretty busy on that front. But it's great. You're not sitting on your thumbs. You're not, just sitting there waiting and being nervous. You're trying to prepare. You're being proactive. We love that. So what are we going to talk about today? Today we're going to talk about a little bit about who we are. We're going to talk about the different types of MBA interviews that are out there and how to approach each one. We're going to talk about how to approach behavioral questions and the framework that we use with clients. We're going to talk about the most common questions that are out there and how to approach them. And then we're going to end with Q&A. So who are we? More specifically, who am I, this voice that's speaking to you? My name is Bhavik. I'm the managing partner here at Critical Square. I'm also one of our consultants. And what we do, one of the things that we do is interview prep, which is why we're having this webinar. Right, because we've done this a lot of times. We've done this very successfully a lot of times, and so we want to talk to you about what we've learned in that process, what our clients have learned from us, right? Because we are all thoroughly difficult interviewers, and that's something we pride ourselves on. We pride ourselves on the difficulty of our sessions, because everyone needs a little bit of practice. So whether you use our firm, any firm, your friends, whatever that might be, if you're going to be successful on your MBA interview, you have to practice. And whether that's just a little bit of a polish because it's been a while since you've been in an interview, or you were always uncomfortable with interviewing and so you need a little bit more practice to become comfortable, wherever you fall on the spectrum, everyone needs practice. Now, one of the things I will say is there is a danger to practicing too much. If you practice too much, you can fall into a trap where you may have scripted answers or canned responses, and that's not what you want, right? You want to have thoughts in your minds. You want to have frameworks around those thoughts. You want to have story matrices that you can pull from, but by no means do you want to say, oh, if this person asks me question X, I'm going to respond by saying this sentence, then this sentence, and that's going to leave you in a position where you sound like a robot. So, with that said, just as a quick mention, anyone who's on this webinar, we really appreciate you being here. So if you do need a hand, you'll receive a discount code after this. We're happy that you guys are planners and that you want to be prepared. So we want to reward you for that. So let's talk about the different types of MBA interviews out there. So the first one is the one you're most familiar with, the traditional interview, 30 minutes long, a couple of questions about who you are, why you want your MBA, a few behavioral questions. Thank you. You're out the door. We'll see you when we tell you what your decision is, right? No curveballs, or very few curveballs, rather. Excuse me. And most schools do this. So who interviews you in this kind of a situation? Well, most programs will utilize a second year known as an admissions fellow, right? So this is a member of a team that looks over applications and looks over, they're the ones who do the legwork on the front end for the admissions committee. And because they're students, they're also closer to the culture, and they can assess potential fit a little bit better. So a lot of admissions committees utilize existing students to interview candidates. Some AdComs, however, have a bit more of a hands-on approach, and we're going to pick on MIT a lot today, not in a bad way, but MIT is a bit specific, but MIT is one of these schools where they are very hands-on, right? You don't meet with a student, you meet with an admissions committee director. And they don't just have your resume in front of you, they have your entire application in front of you. It's on an iPad. Back in the day, it used to be a file folder, but now everyone has an iPad, so they have your entire application. They'll sit down and they'll say, hey, Joe, you in essay 2, in paragraph 3 on sentence 4, you used this word. What did you mean by this word? Why did you pick that word? And so that can be very disconcerting when for most people this interview is very relaxed and enjoyable and friendly. Some interviews, even if they are quote unquote traditional, can be more intense. So where are they conducted? For most people, they're conducted on campus. Some schools absolutely require it, and they will only make exceptions in the rarest of situations. If you're international, if you're remote, most schools will accommodate that by either having dates where they are in those cities, or they'll schedule a Skype conversation with you. Now, one of the aspects, and then before we get to that, actually, and some schools are starting to fly admissions fellows to key cities within the U.S. So, for example, if they have a lot of applicants out of New York and Atlanta and L.A. and San Francisco, they might send admissions fellows there to remove that responsibility from their alumni base. One of the things to keep in mind is a lot of the people on this call, based on the attendee list, you're international. And it's expensive to visit schools. Right? It's expensive to take time off. It's expensive. It's difficult. But there is no stronger signal than you can send than to say, hey, you invited me to interview. I'm very serious about this. I'm so serious I showed up. Right? Some schools are more understanding than others. Some schools, I know we've mentioned this on a previous webinar, some schools are going to judge you for it. Right? If you're looking to get a $120,000 MBA, if you can't finagle a $3,000 airfare ticket, how serious are you? Right? And that goes double for most of the top ranked programs who are getting a ton of international applicants. So think if you've been invited to interview and they offer you an interview on campus, think long and hard before you say that's not going to work for me. The other session that a lot of schools offer is what we call the coffee shop session. The name's a bit misleading, but we'll talk about that. This is generally run by a typical alumni. They've been trained in interviewing. They do it a lot. Same format, right? Behavioral, a few questions. For schools who send admissions fellows abroad, this could be with a student as well. So it's not always with an alumni. But don't let the atmosphere fool you, right? Chances are you're going to meet at like a local coffee shop or a restaurant or something. This is serious business. That alumni or student, you are a potential implication for their brand, right? So they're very serious about this, and you should be too. So just because you're meeting at a coffee shop down the street does not mean you do not show up in a suit. But for some of the alumni, this can also take place like in their offices. In some schools, for example, are notorious for using alumni interviews, Columbia being one of them. You sign up, you're interviewed, you're invited to interview, you sign up, you enter your zip code, it tells you who's in the vicinity, you schedule a time, that person dictates where. Different schools have a different approach here. And then lastly, and this is a newer thing in the last couple of years, and these are sessions that we conduct. So if you need a hand with the team-based component, do let us know. But the team-based exercise is new over the last few years. And so what it is it's a group setting, 5 to 7 of you. It's conducted by a mix of second-year students and admissions committee members. Generally speaking, in the beginning, these pilot programs were offered for those who could make it to campus. And if you couldn't make it to campus, you would meet with an alumni or a student somewhere else, and that would be that. But the schools are starting to see a lot of traction with these programs. They're seeing a lot of great results. And so because of that, they're now starting to implement these programs in cities around the world. So Wharton, for example, has a team-based exercise interview slot dates in Delhi. The admissions committee is going there. They're staying in Delhi for a few days. They're running all of these sessions. Now, that should be if you've been invited to the Wharton interview, that should be a huge flag, right? They're investing a ton of money in this. They're flying people around the world. They're exhausting their team to do this. Now, okay, you're in India, you can't make it to Wharton to visit or to interview, that's fine. If they're going to be in Delhi and you happen to be in Hyderabad, you better go, right? At that point, they are making a huge investment to come to you. They're removing $2,000 to $3,000 in airfare costs, hotel accommodations. They're removing the visa requirement. If you can't get on a regional jet and shoot up to Delhi for a day or two, you're not serious, and that's going to hurt. So be aware of what your options are and what that might, what signals those might send. And one of the things that we talk about often with clients is what are they looking for in this team-based experience, right? They ask you for a solution, they ask you to talk together. They're looking for how you work together, okay? So to get into a school or to get invited to interview at a school like Wharton or Ross, you have to be really, really good. You have to be the best of the best. But the problem is once you get in, you may no longer be the best of the best. In that new pond, you may not be the most intelligent or the most successful, right? Everyone who gets into these programs is great. So at that point, it's how well do you work together? Right? Because you might know a lot, but you're not going to be the expert on everything in the room every time. Right? You have teams, and a lot of this is team-based. Wharton does a lot with your student group. Ross, a lot of collaboration. And they want to have people who are smart, but are smart in a way that allows them to work well with others. So they want to see if you domineer a conversation. They want to see if you engage others in a meaningful discussion. They want to see if you're supportive of other people's ideas. They want to see if someone tells you a differing point of view and gives you some justification or support, that you can accommodate that and adjust appropriately. They're looking for how you work with others. And if you can't convince them of that, it's a bit of a problem. So that's why they have these team-based exercises. So with that said, one of the themes that you probably noticed from what I was saying was a lot of these schools have behavioral components, right? Tell me about a time when. That's how a behavioral question starts, generally, right? So so why do you want a framework when you respond to that? Well, because you want an answer that is concise, that is easy to follow, that gives the listener the information they need to make the most sense of what you're trying to say, and it doesn't lead them in this convoluted, random answer where you repeat information or revisit other parts, and you confuse the interviewer as much as you confuse yourself. Right? You're not telling them a cat in the hat story. You're telling them an example from your life. So in that case, we use the STAR method. And the STAR method is a great framework as you think about the experiences in your life, as you practice for each of these interviews. One of the things that we work with our clients on is a story matrix, right? So what are the 5 to 7 key things you want to communicate about yourself in this interview, or the types of questions they might be asking, and what are the stories that you can pull from? And within this STAR method, how are you going to structure your response? So once again, you're not memorizing anything, but you are very well structured in terms of what you're going to talk about first and what you're going to talk about second, and how you're going to wrap everything up, and how are you going to tie everything together. And the STAR method is fantastic for that. So let's get into, STAR is obviously an acronym, so let's get into that acronym, right? What does the STAR stand for? First, situation. The situation aspect of the STAR method is about describing the situation that you were in or the task that you needed to accomplish. You should be describing a specific event or a situation, not just kind of what you've done in the past. This is where you set the context, right? You want to provide context. You don't want to provide too much context. You don't want to bore the listener. You should spend about 10 to 15 to 20% of your time on your response in the situation section. This is where you tell them how you found yourself in the situation. So an example, let's say, you were on a consulting engagement for a brand new client, and they were having issues with turning a profit, and so your engagement was supposed to deliver $20 million in bottom line benefit by the end of the project. And there were 7 work streams, and you were tasked to lead one of them. Right? That's the situation, which brings us to task. Right? What goal were you working towards, and what was the team tasked with achieving? So if you've been talking about the 20 million, that's the team, and now maybe one of those work streams is the 7 million that you were personally responsible for delivering. right? So now we're talking about you. So we've talked about the team. We've talked about how you fit into the team. We've mentioned some key metrics, right? So in this case, in this particular case, it happens to be dollars. It doesn't always have to be dollars, but in this case, your goal was $7 million. And you're not necessarily using a bunch of jargon. You're not spending too long on this section. You just want to set up the task. And you're not making things generic, right? You're telling them, hey, this work stream was financial and operations related, right? And so you're being specific, which leads you then to the bulk of your response, which is the action, right? What did you do? What were the specific steps that you took to do this? And by no means do I mean list out the steps. So if the first step was to analyze data, and the second step was to run an analysis, and the third step was to identify solutions, and the fourth step was to run a model, and the fifth step was to create, no, I don't care. That's not what I'm looking for here, right? Think about, as you completed this task, right, what did you do from a people perspective? What did you do from a management perspective? What did you do from an analytics and a quantitative perspective? What did you do from a presentation perspective? So, for example, in this example, let's say your two key stakeholders are your CFO and your COO. You're really focused in finance. You're really focused in operations. To get to your $7 million number, you really got to get these two people on board. And so one of your actions could be, look, I recognized early on that I really need to be, have the support of the CFO and the COO. So one of the things that I did was I wanted to make sure that they felt engaged and that I had their buy-in. So I set up weekly meetings with them. I created a weekly report for them. I, sat in their office for 2 hours at the beginning of the project to make sure I understood their concerns. Right? Actions, right? What's your task? What are these complicating factors? What was your action that you took to address them? And at no point should you just be vague and say, oh, well, I collaborated with key stakeholders. That's not even neutral. That's a negative. If that's all you say, I, as the interviewer, I'm going to mark you down for that. And that's because that's fluff. That means nothing to me. But if you say I collaborated with key stakeholders, specifically I had the CFO and the COO, and then you talk about all that other stuff I just talked about, now you go from having a claim that you collaborated to showing me the support, how you did it, why you did it, what, you show rather than tell. And that applies to the model as well. Let's say this is an example that you're using to highlight your quantitative capabilities. Don't just tell me that there were 6,000 rows of data. Tell me what made that so complicated. Was it that some divisions didn't want to give you their data? Was it that data came in different ways? Was it that you couldn't understand the data because no one would explain it, and you had to go track down people and better understand the business? So go deeper, right? And that leads you very naturally to results, right? So what happened? What did you accomplish? Talk about your impact, but don't just talk about your KPIs. This is not a numbers game, right? So if you let's say you were on this project for, $7 million, and you got $8 million. That is not what you say. You don't say, oh, well, you exceeded expectations and got $8 million. Yes, you mentioned that. But maybe, because this was the first project, the CFO and the CEO were so impressed with this project and its turnout and you specifically that they signed on for additional work. They asked for you personally to come back. That's a result, and that's something you should take credit for, right? So don't just repeat your resume. Don't just mention KPIs. Discuss what you learned. Tie things back. Talk about impact. Talk about why it mattered. That's what's most important. And why do we want to follow this? Because if you don't follow this method, you could find yourself where you spend far too long talking about the context or the background, and then you rush through the task, and maybe you don't talk about the actions, right? So if all you told me, and if I told you about, if I asked you to tell me a professional accomplishment that meant something to you, and you said, hey, we landed on the ground, there's this $20 million goal, I was tasked with $7 million of it, at the end of it, we built this massive model, we got all these great savings initiatives out of it, and we ended up with $8 million instead of $7 million. You missed out on the key aspect of what this could have been for you. You could have been talking about collaboration. You could have been talking about working with others. You could have been talking about impact. And instead, because you didn't follow the STAR method, you've glossed over the most important part, right? And as I mentioned, situation and task can be about 20%, but action, that needs to be 40, 50, 60% of your response. And a school like MIT, and I know I'm harping on MIT here, but a school like MIT, if you don't answer the action part, they'll just keep asking you until they get the answer that they're looking for. And the more questions they have to ask you to get there, the worse it is for you, right? So anticipate. Think about what your interviewer wants out of this. Because one of the main things is behavioral questions are asked because previous behaviors are very, very strong indicators, very strongly correlated with future performance and future decisions. So how you reacted or how you behaved in a situation in the past tells me a lot about how you might do so again, right? And so if you were to tell me about the CFO and the COO and how you worked closely with them and you made sure everything worked, I would be like, oh, okay, so this individual, when presented with a problem, thinks about the people, thinks about how to overcome cultural issues, organizational issues, versus, oh, this person is just really focused on the numbers. How you convey a story tells me a lot about you. I don't really care about the story itself. I mean, yes, the story has to be good, but the story itself is not the big deal. It's how you tell me about the story that tells me about you. So with that said, that's the STAR method. And with that said, I want to move into some of the more common MBA questions that you're going to see. And not a lot. We're not going to talk about mostly behavioral questions here. These are going to be very, very common, and they'll apply to the vast majority of you. And I want to make sure we save time for Q&A at the end because there are a lot of questions coming in. They're very good questions, so I want to make sure we have time to answer some of them. So the first one, riddle me this. Tell me about yourself. Right? It's always going to start with this question. Either tell me about yourself or walk me through your resume, something like that. And this is perhaps one of the most problematic questions for every interview prep client we ever have. And it's for a very simple reason. You're not fully aware of what the question is asking you for. It's vague, it's ambiguous, it's nebulous. I mean, tell me about yourself. I don't know. I broke my arm in the 3rd grade playing hockey. I mean, at that point, what do you want to know about me, right? It's the first question. It's a vague question. And most applicants end up with this deer in the headlights look, and then they stumble through their response. There are a couple of issues with this that we see. One, response length. Let's talk about that first. A good response for this should be somewhere between 2.5 and 3.5/4 minutes. Okay, you don't want to ramble. You don't want to give too little information. You want to have a good, solid response, right? And additionally, this is a business school interview. You are a professional, right? This is not where you tell me about what your dog's name was when you were 10. I don't care. This is a professional interview, right? So about 2/3 to 75% of your response should be professional focused. And an additional 1/3 to 25% should be personal focused. So most interviewers will only have their resume in front of you. I can see where you went to school. I can see what jobs you have. The purpose of this question is paint the picture. Give me the context and the background behind your resume. Give me additional information such that I can look at your resume in a new light and understand things. So essentially you're defining the sandbox, right? You're talking about at a very high level the things that you want to cover in this interview, and you should mention things that you want to highlight. So let's say there's one particular example you really, really want to talk about. It's kind of obscure, but it means a lot to you, okay? And it's in your resume, but it's not like a big thing, but you really, really want to talk about it, and you don't mention it here. You don't tell me that thing when I ask you to tell me about yourself. And let's say when I was looking at this resume, that item never jumped out at me, and I don't ask you about it. Well, now you're going to walk away from this interview with that amazing golden nugget in your pocket still, right? So you want to make sure that you convey the aspects that you really want to talk about. This is going to set the tone for the entire interview. It's going to serve as a springboard for what I ask. It's going to help me form my initial opinion of you. It's a very important question. And what we see a lot of, and I'll give you an example. We had a client who just had their interview for the Haas EMBA program, and he was the quintessential client in terms of this question. The first time we spoke to him, his response, 6.5 minutes. Something super. I asked him this question, and I just sat there and listened to him talk to me. About halfway through, I'm human, right? So I started losing attention. The answer is super long. So I'm listening to him talk, and he's going back and forth. He's talking a little bit about his professional life. Then he talks about his family, and then he talked about moving to the U.S. Then he talked about kayaking, and then he talked about his recent job, and then he went back to talk about his job back in Europe. So not only is it long, it's confusing, it's weighted improperly, but the improvement he made was astronomical, right? At the end, the fourth session we had with him, he was crisp, the balance, the ratios were balanced. He was talking about why he pursued his undergraduate degree, where his passions lay, what he had been working on, how each piece of his resume fit together to the next one. He's like I said, he's a big family guy, so he talked about his family. He talked about why he moved to the U.S. He talked about kayaking. We're not saying don't talk about these personal things, but the ratio was off, but it didn't flow. So at the end of that, and when he finally, that fourth session, his answer was like 3.5 minutes. It was perfect. I was engaged the entire time because it was moving at a good clip. I could follow it, and at the end of it, on the table were all of the things that we would eventually talk about during that interview. It was perfect. So that's telling me about yourself. Why an MBA? Why now? There are 2 times, first of all, that this question can be asked. Okay? It can be asked either after they have asked about your goals, or it can be asked before they ask about your goals. If they're asking this before they ask about your goals, you have to mention your goals. You don't have to make this response all about your goals, but you do need to talk a little bit about your goals, because a lot of times people want their MBA for professional reasons, hopefully, right? Hopefully you're not just going there for a 2-year party. You want a professional bump. And so if you're going to talk about why this MBA is going to help you, and you haven't really told me what it is you want to do afterwards, you're not allowing me to connect the dots. So always start, if it comes after, start with that. The more important thing within a why MBA, and generally this is followed either in the same sentence or the same breath with why an MBA, why school X, this is a fit question. This is a research question, right? All of those alumni that you spoke with, all of the students that you spoke with, all the research you did, this is where it comes into play, right? Because this is where you sell them on why you want your MBA and why this particular school is perfect for you. So one of the things that we get a lot of is, people tell us fluffy reasons on why they want an MBA. So one of the ones we get a lot is the network. The network is powerful. Okay, so to be blunt, the network for 85 or 90% of an MBA class really doesn't matter. Yeah, you make some friends, you make some lifelong connections. Absolutely, this network follows you around for the rest of your life along with the brand, but you don't use it immediately, right? Let's say you went you go to an MBA program because you have a business, you want to grow it for a couple years, and you need funding, okay? In that case, the Harvard network, super valuable. Right? They know a lot of VCs. They have a huge footprint in the Bay Area. They have a huge footprint in New York, Boston, all of these VC PE firms. If you need funding, the Harvard network will be very, very valuable. But if you're going to consulting, what's the network going to do for you? Right? I mean, it's on-campus recruiting. Right? The network's not going to help you. You're going to go to work for Bain or McKinsey. What are you going to do with that? you'll stay in touch. You'll go to an alumni event in your city, maybe if you're not in that same city with the school. But that's pretty much it for a while. So make sure that your why MBA really ties to you personally, ties to your goals personally. Don't just say stuff, right? Make sure it matters. Now that's one of the biggest issues we see with this question. Either it's vague, or the components that the individual selects are not optimal. So that leads us to, well, what are your short and long-term goals? And this is where we really get into the nitty-gritty with a lot of clients, because what they tell us isn't compelling. So assuming that you are not interviewing with an admissions committee member who has your application in front of them. So if you're interviewing with a student or an alumni, all they have is your resume. They don't have your essays where you talk all about, what you wanted to be when you grew up. They don't have that. So they're asking, but they're not asking because, they're going to write down, oh, I met with candidate X and candidate X wants to go into consulting. That's not what they're writing on the form. What they're writing on the form is candidate X says they want to go into consulting, but they have absolutely no idea what it means. They're looking for the maturity of your goals, the researched nature of your goals, how realistic they are, how ambitious they are. They're judging you on how you came to your goals and your solutions, not on the goals themselves. They're trying to figure out if you know how to get there. That's what they're trying to assess. And so a lot of times, if you have pretty standard goals, let's say you want to go into consulting, then that's okay, but make sure you lay out, here's how the MBA will play in, and here's step A, and after, step A comes maybe step B, or step, B1 or B2, and then by, I eventually want to get to C. So lay it out. Just because it's conventional doesn't mean it can't be very compelling. And if you have a goal that is strange, right? Maybe it doesn't quite make sense to the reader. Maybe you came from like IT services and you want to go to banking. I'm gonna hear that and I'm gonna have questions. Alarms are going off all around my head, right? But if you were to sit down and be like, all right, so one of the things that, here's why I love finance. That's a big one, right? If you haven't told me you love finance and you just want to go to banking, what, money? Here's why I love finance. Here's what I've been doing that I think I can leverage. Here's all the people I spoke to and the alumni and people who in my situation have been successful in making this transition. Hey, I understand it's going to be difficult, but this is really where my passion lies, and these are the classes I think that'll work. And so you weave your all of your responses together over the course of an interview to make sure that I understand that you know what you're talking about. But if you're vague or if you're immature about your goals, you can guarantee that I'm writing it down in my form. So now, and like I said, I want to keep at least 30 minutes, at least 20 minutes open for questions, so we won't talk too much about this one. But this is an example of a behavioral question, right? This is the STAR method in a nutshell. And this will be something that probably 75% of you on this call will get in an interview. So I'll walk through an example, right? So we had a client, a consultant. He led a pro bono engagement for a nonprofit. A pro bono engagement, for those who aren't familiar with the term, is where the consulting firm doesn't engage in any fee structure, and it's generally run by junior staff. It's a way for them to kind of get more experience, etc. It's fun, it's exciting, it can be interesting depending on the client. So this individual was leading. His example is going to be out leading a pro bono engagement. Perfect. So when we talk about the situation, right? He was a part of the core team in the previous phase with this nonprofit. This nonprofit had multiple phases of pro bono projects. He was a core team member in the phase before. He had done a great job. So then that team's leadership as well as the client leadership had tasked him with leading the next phase. That's important for the situation. Then he talked a little bit about what the project was that this nonprofit needed help with. It was an interesting nonprofit, so he had that benefit working for him. It was very relatable. So he talked about that. Then he talked about the task, which was both for him as a leader as well as for his team as being led by him, and as well as for the project overall. Then he talked about his actions, once again, both as a leader as well as tactically for his team and what he did, how he worked with his clients, etc. And then he talked about the results, and the results were the client was thrilled, it's going forward, their board approved it, the next phase for this nonprofit engagement is kicking off soon, right? So he walks through all of it, and he spent a lot of time talking about the team, how he built the team, what the challenges were, what he learned from this experience. He used the STAR method, and that was a very powerful way of communicating this story. Versus saying, oh, I had to lead this team for this nonprofit engagement, and this was the goal of the project, and we achieved it, and everyone was happy. It was awesome. That's not what they're looking for, right? So this is where the STAR method really comes in. Last, any questions for me is a question that most interviewers will ask, and your response to this will need to vary by your audience. Now, I'm not saying say something the other party wants to hear, but the other party has different questions that they can answer. So a current student is much closer to the community, so they can talk about, they can talk about the culture, they can talk about the school. You could even ask, hey, you were probably looking at a few different programs when you were applying. Why did you decide on school X? An alumni who's been out of school for 15, 20 years isn't going to be able to talk about classes, right? So for them, it might be about what advice they have for you, or what was the most important thing they took away from that experience, etc. For the admissions committee member, it may be about the direction of the program, or maybe where are you going to take entrepreneurship in the next 3 to 5 years if that's what you're interested in, or if it ties to your goals, etc. So your questions do have to vary by your audience, because different audiences are going to react differently to different questions. So with that, and there's a perfect slide to actually transition to actually any questions for me. So now we're going to move to the Q&A section. Give me a moment. You guys have been typing some great questions throughout the webinar, so I'm just going to scroll up and start finding some that I think would be really good for us. So one, right. So, okay, here's a good one. What's the difference between walk me through your resume and tell me about yourself? Great question. It'll be worded in different ways. There isn't much of a difference, to be honest. They're both still professionally based. They're both still looking for the context, right? So if you're going to walk me through your resume, maybe you had one experience that doesn't quite match with your second experience, in which case, when you walk me through your resume, you're walking me through why you made that decision. It's all about context. It's all about story. Maybe your undergrad, your major was important to talk about, and so you want to start there. Maybe you don't. Whatever your story is, right? The story is greater than the sum of your resume. It's passions, it's interests. If you've done your resume correctly for the MBA process, there should be a personal section, so you can talk about personal things. You can talk about, volunteerism if you have it in there. You can talk about a lot of different things. So they're really not different questions per se. Let's look on. And here's a question actually that works well off of that one. When you're talking about walk me through your resume, should I start at the undergrad or just with my first work experience? That's a great question. If your undergrad adds value to the story, then I would spend a little bit of time thinking about that. So, for example, let's say you're really into high-tech programming. That's the field that you're in, high-tech solutions, and you were always really passionate about technology and computers, and that's why you pursued computer science in college, and you've been doing it ever since, and you've loved it. If that's the case, then you should definitely talk in depth about why you chose that school and how you thought of that experience and how it's, how you've grown with it. But if you did something generic, like let's say you did like finance or economics, and now you're in consulting or banking, you don't need to say as much about your undergrad because you went to undergrad, you got a pretty generic major that would give you the most job options. So at that point, you have to gauge personally how much value is this adding to the narrative that I'm trying to tell, and what's the opportunity cost of spending time on the undergrad versus not spending time on the undergrad. So for the computer science person, the opportunity cost was low because there was a lot of value in that. But if you just talk a lot about where you went to school to study finance, you're sabotaging yourself from being able to speak about some more interesting things. So let's see. Next question. Here's one. How important are the interviews in the process? Super important. Critical. There are so many different adjectives I could use. They are very, very, very important. Because if you think about interviews, and this is once again talking about schools where you've been invited to interview, they got 10,000 applications. They decided to interview, 2,000 of them, which means you met all the first hurdles, right? They think you're interesting. They like your GMAT scores. Your GPA is good. You went to a good school. You work for some good companies. You met all these hurdles, right? And now they're interviewing you. And now you're sitting in this room waiting for your name to be called next to someone on your right and someone on your left who are both equally, if not more so, awesome than you are, right? So at this point, they're really just trying to figure out if you fit. And because that's all they're really trying to do, the interview is beyond important because you're not competing on some objective scale. You already met those criteria. You're already in for the interview. And I know a lot of schools tout pretty high acceptance rates off the interview list, right? Like, 50 to 70% of our interviewees get invites. And those are very comforting numbers. I get it. But the fact of the matter is, it's not a sure thing. And, if you have the same experience as someone else, but they just do a better job communicating it, you're out, right? I mean, one of the things they're looking for in an interview is how will this individual represent my brand? And if you're not a very well-spoken, well-communicated individual, you're not going to represent it very well. Interviews are incredibly, incredibly important. Whether you're sitting across from an admissions director whose job this is, if you're sitting across from a student whose school this is, or if you're sitting across from an alumni whose brand this is important. But great question. Here's one. Okay, let me respond to this. Somebody wrote, how do I address an ethical issue I had in my past? That's a really great question. Unfortunately, I can't answer it in the webinar. I don't know what the situation was. I don't know under what kind of questions you may be using that example. That's something that we would work with you through the interview prep. But and it's a great question. I'm sure a lot of people on this webinar have ethical dilemmas in their past, but everyone is so unique, and it's just it's difficult to answer on a webinar. So I'm sorry, but if definitely think about that, and if you work with us, then that's something we'll help you think through. Here's one. How detrimental are uhs and ums? Mine were about 20% of my response included these. Okay, so uhs and ums aren't the end of the world. I've been umming and ahhing all over the place, but I'm on a webinar and you're not judging me. Well, there I go again. Ums and ahs in an interview are okay in moderation. 20% is high. I hope you rounded up from 5. 20% is high, right? And you really want to make sure it's not that high. Because as an interviewer, I'm going to wonder if that's just how you speak, if you're trying to think on the fly and you're not very good at it, or if you're trying to make something up. there are a lot of flags that go off when you start umming and ahhing over responses, and it can be detrimental. And not only that, it's going to break the flow. If 1 out of every 5 words is an as an interviewer, I'm just going to start zoning out. I mean, it's when somebody uses like a lot. It's distracting. It's annoying after a certain period of time because you're trying to gather value, and they keep peppering up the flow with these verbal breaks. So ums and ahs, you don't need a flawless interview, but definitely try to keep it down as much as possible. Practice will help. It's ironic that I followed that answer with an HBS, here's a good one. HBS has, or how do I prepare for an HBS interview, specifically the rapid fire portion? Simple answer. Practice. Practice, practice, practice. In the rapid fire component of the interview, there are 2 things that throw applicants off. There are 2 aspects, right? One is the nature in which they are asking it, the process, and one is the question itself. You can prepare for the questions to some degree by researching what they might ask and talking to others, etc., and by doing a lot of legwork in terms of figuring out how you might want to respond to maybe 80% of the most common ones. But if you don't practice, you'll never be comfortable with the rapid fire component of it. So, but if you practice, you're more and more okay with that delivery method. So the only thing throwing you off in that interview is, what do I answer with? Not, oh my God, this is so weird, I'm not used to this. Because if you have both, then the fact that the process is new and different to you will throw you off from what you'll respond with. But you can practice away the uncomfortability with the process. You can't necessarily practice away all of your answers, right? You can't. But you can definitely become more comfortable in that setting, and that'll help. All right. Let's see what else we got here. This is a good question. How do I talk about an accomplishment for a later question if I already spoke about this accomplishment in my tell me about yourself question? That's a great question. The reason you did that is because you're an oversharer. If we kind of go back to the slide where we talked about how to respond to that question, you're setting the sandbox. You're talking about context. You're talking about high-level thoughts. You're defining the realm within which this interview will take place. So, you can talk about being a consultant. You can talk about being on types of projects. But then when I ask you about an accomplishment, that's when you tell me about this $20 million cost savings project where you led $7 million. You don't tell me those numbers and tell me about yourself, right? And if you're targeting that 3.5 minute mark, you don't have time to tell me all that. Or maybe you had a new, innovative department within a big company, and you saved them $25 million. You don't tell me that then, right? You tell me the innovative thing you're doing, and then when I ask you about an accomplishment, then you tell me about this $25 million and how you did it and why you did it and what the results were, etc. Then you go to the STAR method. So if you run into a problem where you've already talked about an example, that example shouldn't be in the tell me about yourself. That's too granular of a detail level. Let's see. Oh, here's a good one. How honest should I be when I'm asked what other schools I'm applying to? So that's a wonderful question. And a lot of schools will ask you this. Some ask it on the application, some will ask it in the interview itself. And the fact of the matter is, the guidance we always give is pick one school that's higher, pick one school that's at maybe the same level, and pick maybe 1 or 2 schools that are lower ranked. And the reason for that is simple. Every school wants to feel special. Every school is worried about their yield, right? Every school is worried that, you're not going to come there. They're going to accept you in this interview. You're going to get an interview invite, and then you're going to say, no, sorry, I'm going to this better ranked school over here. So if you're applying to Harvard and Stanford, and then you tell them, and you're interviewing at Tuck, and you say, oh, where else did you apply? Harvard and Stanford. Tuck's not going to feel very special, right? And if you're a very good client who maybe gets into Harvard or Stanford, Tuck doesn't want to waste an invite on you anyway, right? And if you're not a great enough client that can get into Harvard and Stanford, then me as Tuck, I'm like, look, even we're on the fence about you. Harvard and Stanford are definitely not going to accept you, so I don't think you're being very realistic in your school. There are a lot of different ththings that I'm judging you on when I say this. And one of the things is, as you pick these programs, hopefully you've applied to them, and you've done that. But make sure that the schools that you pick make sense together, right? So if you're going to tell Tuck, hey, I find the small environment super valuable, and then I ask you where else you're applying, and you say, oh, well, I'm applying to Columbia. That doesn't make any sense to me, right? So I'm going to then not only question where you're applying, I'm also going to question your answer to a previous, question, because your logic has now, you've shot a hole in your own logic, right? If a town of Hartford, or sorry, if where you're going in Dartmouth is small and secluded, and now you're talking about a city with 9 million people, well, it's actually probably more. Whatever. So it doesn't make sense. So pick schools that make sense from the things that are important to you, that make sense for your goals, etc. We have a little bit more time, so let's end on a couple of good questions. 1 second, let me try to find one here. Here's a great question. What if you haven't saved the company $25 million? How do you communicate something, like organizing a holiday party, or bridging 2 offices? So how do you talk about these impacts? That's a wonderful question, because a lot of people on this call will not have had $25 million benefits that they drove for their company, and that's okay, right? If you look at the STAR method, it's all about communicating the impact and the results that you had, but also, equally importantly, setting the situation for why the things that you did mattered and why they had to be done. So let's say you work in a company that's very siloed, right? Like finance doesn't talk to accounting, which doesn't talk to marketing, which doesn't talk to operations, or maybe you work for a company that bought another company, and you're in office A in Austin, and they're in another office in Los Angeles. So the bridging companies are having the holiday party. In your situation, you would have to talk about why this made things difficult, right? So maybe because it was so siloed, people didn't talk, and it was very difficult to get work done, and then there were no friendships or whatever. Or maybe the acquired company was completely new, and they kept all the staff, so nobody in Austin knew anybody in Los Angeles except for management, and there were some issues there, and so you hosted this holiday party, and after which the finance person met the accounting person, who then they're now working together, or marketing and operations have friendships, and there's more cross-functional collaboration, or whatever those results are. Or maybe the offices now have there's more travel between the offices, or there have been events between the 2 offices, or maybe you implemented some kind of friendly competition so that people, whatever it might be. It's okay if it doesn't have a dollar amount. Results don't have to be dollar amount related. And I think that's a wonderful question, because a lot of people don't have significant dollars, right? And I think some people feel insecure in this process, where they're like, well, I saved the company $150,000, and that person over there saved the company $7 million. How am I supposed to compete with that? Well, you compete if you can communicate that achievement and what you learned and how you did it. Because if the person with the $7 million savings can't communicate it well, then you might win. And if they communicate it in a bad way that says something negative about themselves, then that helps you as well. So it's not just about what you have done. If they've invited you to interview, excuse me, if they've invited you to interview, then they're clearly happy with your accomplishments. They want to hear you talk about you as an individual and why you do the things that you do. All right, so let's do. Let's see if we can find one more to end on. All right. Okay. All right. So here's a good question about the goals. And so he says, do I need, when I'm answering a question about goals, do I need to say a specific company name, or can I keep it a bit more generic and just talk about what I want to do in a loose way? That's a wonderful question. We have a video on defining short and long-term goals. You don't want to be uber specific. You don't want to say I'm coming to school X because I want to work with company Y. But if it's company Y and company Z or companies like company A, in that case, you've defined of this vast pie of jobs and industries available, you've defined the industry and you've defined the sector and you've thrown out a few analog companies and a few analog roles. And at that point, that's fairly specific, right? And at that point, the research that you've done, if you can communicate to me why you think you would be valuable to me in that role as a recruiter, that's the level of insight and maturity that I want to see. And if you keep it too specific, you lose out on that kind of higher level inclination, professional inclination on your part. And if you keep it too vague, I don't know if you've really narrowed it down, right? Because 2 years go by very quickly, and I want to know what you're going to do for those 2 years. So there's a balance to strike. And remember, you can always go more specific. You can never, it's very difficult to go more macro, because if you start out by saying, at that middle level, that mezzanine level, and saying, hey, this is the kind of industry I'm interested in, the sector I'm interested in, and then you want to talk a little, and they're receptive to that, you want to talk a little bit more about that, you have that option, and that option value is valuable. So, okay, so on that question, thank you all again for coming. For those of you, some of you it's late night, thank you for staying up with us. For those of you in the middle of the day, thank you for taking time out of the middle of your day to do this. We hope it was valuable. As I mentioned, the attendees, if you're here, you're going to get an email after this with a recording. You're going to get a code. Like I said, you're preparing. You're doing something to really rock this interview. We respect that. We want to reward that. So there's 10%. There will be a 10% code off for our interview prep services. Whether you work with us, you work with someone else, or you work with friends, good luck. Definitely prepare. Definitely practice. It'll pay off. We promise. And hopefully for those of you who have your fingers crossed, waiting for some of that news, we hope the best of news comes soon. And we'll be in touch next time. Thanks, everyone.